So, what do we mean when we talk about legislation? Or just prior to that, I should say, each state itself, of course, has its own setup. In Queensland, there is only one house rather than having an upper house. That was abolished a while back, and but other states like South Australia and Victoria and so forth have two houses of parliament. At least I'm pretty sure Victoria does. Anyway, don't quote me on that. Okay, now let's have a look at this. This is a piece of legislation. It's called the Workplace Health and Safety Act. And what we're trying to do is to understand it, because it's very important that we understand the notion of the Workplace Health and Safety Act 1995. You'll see if you look at that slide, it's reprinted as in force on the 26th of October 2009. Now, it may have had reprints and alterations to it since, because acts get constantly altered and changed. That's had some fairly major changes since 1995 when it was first enacted. Okay, so, but how do we read it? I mean, is it just like a book? I mean, is it a bunch of rules that you apply and it should be self-evident from the time that you read it yourself? Well, one of the biggest mistakes we make is to believe that legislative interpretation is somehow easy. It is the worst and hardest part of practicing law. Let me tell you, it's absolutely atrocious. A lot of people come to it thinking that it's very straightforward, but in fact it's much easier to operate in the common law system than it is to operate where legislation impacts, and legislation has a large impact, particularly in Queensland. Okay, and I'll tell you why. I'll give you an example of why. First of all, you've got the Workplace Health and Safety Act. But is that enough? Well, you've also got the Workplace Health and Safety Regulations 2008. And these are regulations that flow out of the Act. The Act has to be passed through Parliament. Regulations can be made by ministers, and so, but they have to be derived from the authority that the Act has given them. And the regulations, once again, give a bit more detail, if you like, to quite specific factors. We'll go through a few of those to show you how that works. Okay, so now I've got two bits of things. I should be pretty happy with that. Okay, I can read those. What happens next? Oh, bugger. What's inside them? It's inside the actual regulations, or inside both the regulations and the original Act, are these sections called the definition sections. That makes it easier, one would think. Much easier to understand. Like, what's an assessment instrument? This tells you what an assessment instrument is. You start to get an idea that every word has a meaning, which is a very specifically defined meaning. But how do they define those meanings? Well, it's got to be clearly defined, otherwise people will get confused and there'll be lots of argument about definitions, which there invariably is anyway, but you want to try and avoid as much of that as you can. So there's another act called the Acts Interpretation Act of 1954 as amended, and that's been, I think it's 2008 or more now, probably even past 2008. There's probably more amendments now to the Acts Interpretation Act, and you'll find in the Acts Interpretation Act statements about how to interpret acts themselves. There's a paragraph from it interpreting. It says that your interpretation has to achieve the interpretation best achieving the Act's purpose. So everything that's written in an Act should be read in that light. And there's quite a bit in the Acts Interpretation Act. There we are. So there it is, a bit bigger, so you can have a look at it. Now if you look at the bottom of it, you'll see it's even got an example. Just pull this example out. There's a judiciary authority for rule of interpretation that taxing legislation is to be interpreted strictly and in a taxpayer's favour. And then you see it says C, Partington v AG, brackets 1869 brackets LR 4 HL 100 at 122. Now that's a reference to case law. Now what the hell is case law? It was starting to look good, but it ain't over yet. Because now what we've got on top of all of that, we've got the judiciary. That was the best looking judge I could find. The picture there is the High Court. Now, what happens with the judiciary is that they look at the definition, so if there's a dispute about it, they look at the definitions, they look at all the acts involved, and then they make a decision. Now those decisions are printed usually in case reports, and they'd be the Supreme Court reporter or the High Court reports, and most lawyers will have a physical set of books. You see them sitting behind lawyers whenever you see them talking. But generally speaking, these days we use a site called AustLII, Australian Legal Information Service,